Initiation by Elisabeth Haich. Chapter 16. Struggle for Light. I was trying to capture the world beyond, but I didn't know how to set about doing it. I felt like someone who was trying to conquer a jungle, but who did not know where to start, and whose only instrument was a little axe with which to cut a path through the undergrowth. He knows the jungle to be full of lurking dangers, poisonous snakes and wild animals. He might well lose his way and fall into some abyss. Yet his ignorance of these dangers lends him the necessary courage to penetrate the jungle all the same. I did not know that my voyage of discovery into the other world was going to be fraught with dangers, that unknown forces from regions of the subconscious would hurl themselves upon me like wild animals, that will-o'-the-wisps would lead me down false trails, and that abysses of madness were lurking on every side. All I had was my little axe, my normal human common sense. Where was I to begin? Religion talks about the life beyond, yet all the priests I had talked to up until that moment had either wanted me to believe all sorts of dogmas, which they themselves did not really understand, or they told me sentimental stories about the kingdom of heaven, which they themselves did not believe, but which they deemed adequate to satisfy the little woman, in quotes. I preferred to find out what the world's great philosophers thought of this tremendously important question, the meaning of life and death, and as I had never heard of great Oriental philosophers, I began to study the works of European thinkers. First of all, I read the ancient Greek and Roman works translated into a language I could understand. I was enraptured by Socrates, Plato, Pythagoras, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius. Under the influence of these great men, my mind matured, and I learned very much from their teachings, especially one little sentence of Epictetus. Epictetus remained with me on my voyage like an eternal flame and helped me to cross over from darkness into light. And this is a sentence in quotes. Things are never bad. It's the way you think about them. From the moment I read that sentence, I tried to change my complete frame of mind, my spiritual position, to think differently about things. Yet all these truths could not supply the answer to my great question concerning the great beyond. Later on, I read the newer philosophers, Kant, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, Descartes, Pascal, Spinoza. None could satisfy me. I felt that they had all gone as far as reason and intellect could take them, but they had not reached the ultimate goal, union. In fact, they were less capable of answering this question than the ancient philosophers. Among these modern philosophers, Spinoza probably achieved the highest degree in this quest, but I felt that the newest thinkers had somehow entangled themselves in their own cerebral convolutions and come to a dead end. In spite of their philosophical systems, they had remained discontented, disappointed, and unhappy men. How indeed could they have helped me find the great truths of the other world? They themselves were ignorant of them and had searched for them as desperately as I was doing. I wanted reality, not words. One autumn day I stood at the window of our apartment with my small son and watched the leaves of a chestnut tree floating slowly to earth. As I had so often done before, I meditated upon the meaning of life and death. Death, I thought. Death, again and again. Suddenly, I heard a voice in me speaking. Death, why do you persist in seeing but the one side of truth? What do the trees and nature reveal in spring? Life, again and again. Life and death, alternate in an everlasting circle. Death is but the other side of life. In this moment, I saw quite clearly that as life recedes from the tree and its leaves in autumn, the leaves become lifeless, empty husks, fall off and die, but only empty husks. The essence of life, which has lived in the leaves, now rests in the tree and bursts forth again in spring, clothes itself anew with new material form, and becomes leaves again. Repeating the eternal cycle. The tree inhales and exhales life, and only the leaves change, only the outer shell. Life remains eternal, for life is the eternal being. And I saw even further the fountain of eternal existence. Human beings call it God. Breathes life into man, just as the Bible says that God breathed life into Adam's nostrils. When God inhales again, withdrawing his breath, so that the empty husk falls, the body of man dies. Yet life does not cease at that moment. It clothes itself with a new body in an eternal cycle and moves on, as everything in this world lives and moves in rhythm, from the orbit of the planets to the breath and pulse of every living creature. Then, in a flash, I suddenly remembered how, at the age of 6 or 7, when I first heard about death, I had stood before the mirror, examining the picture of the invisible, my own reflection. Even at that early age, I simply could not understand that I would one day have to die, that I would someday cease to exist. I wanted to see where this I was that was thinking these things and did not want to die. I kept looking into the mirror, moving closer and closer till my nose touched the glass. I looked into my own eyes. From as near as I could get, I wanted to see this I. And even though there was a black hole in my eye, I couldn't see me. The I, myself, was invisible, just as I had always imagined it to be ever since I first became conscious on this earth. Even in the mirror, I could not see me, only my face, my mask, and the 2 black holes in my eyes, out of which I was looking. I felt very clearly it was impossible for me not to exist. Good, I asked myself as I stood before the mirror. But what will you be looking at the world through? But what will you be looking at the world through when these eyes are someday closed? Through 2 other eyes, I answered without a moment's hesitation. Here I will close these eyes, and in a new body I will open 2 new eyes. And what if there is a time delay between the 2 bodies? What if you do not find a new body right away? What if you have to wait a week, or perhaps months, years, or even thousands of years? That just cannot be, answered the little girl that I was then. For when I fall asleep, I do not know on awakening how long I have been asleep. In sleep there is no time, and in death it will be the same as long as I am without a body. Whether I spend a week in darkness and nothingness, or 1,000 years, it's all the same. I will feel as if I just closed my eyes here and opened them again there. In nothingness there is no time, but my ceasing to exist just cannot be. And then I left the mirror completely satisfied to go on playing. Now, as I stood before the mirror, before the window, as an adult and recognized the law of reincarnation in the chestnut tree, the memory of this childhood experience flashed through my mind, and I was astonished that a child could find this truth so naturally and spontaneously, with its little primitive understanding, without ever having heard or read anything about reincarnation. Now, I would not say that there is no time in darkness, but rather that in the unconscious there is no time concept. Now I also understood how it was possible for me to carry within me the blurred and hazy memories of a person I had been long before. The vision of ancient Egypt was only old memories bobbing up into consciousness. My search for the other world and life beyond this one, and my ideas about reincarnation, turned my attention to spiritualism. Spiritualists claim to be able to establish contact with spirits of the departed dead, and they also believe in reincarnation. However, I had a pronounced antipathy towards spiritualism because at home I had heard my parents speak about it in a rather disparaging way. Mother had a very dear friend who concerned herself with spiritualism. Mother told us that this friend held spiritualistic seances, and that during these experiments a heavy, massive oaken table would rise up in the air. Mother never participated in these seances and never concerned herself with such things at all, because she was convinced that such experiments were harmful for the nerves. While I was reflecting about the reincarnation, I remembered that once, as a young girl, I had participated in such a stance at the home of this elderly woman, without my mother's knowledge of it. Oh, it's a typo on that line. Okay, that line should read, while I was reflecting about reincarnation, I remembered that once, as a young girl, I had participated in such a seance at the home of this elderly lady without my mother's knowledge of it. That is, of course, if what we experienced then could be called a seance. My mother's elderly friend loved her grandchildren very much and often invited young people to lunch. I was often one of the guests at these young people's luncheons. Once, several of us stayed on after the others had left. The lady was of a gay and sparkling nature and enjoyed talking with us youngsters. I was 15, and the other children were about the same age. We were curious and eager to hear the kind lady tell us about spiritualism. If you wish, she said, we can watch the table move. All of us young folks agreed immediately and began to wonder what was going to happen next. A table was brought in for the experiment. It was not the heavy oaken table Mother had talked about, but a little table with only 3 legs. The lady set the table in the middle of the room, and we youngsters stood around it with the palms of our hands on top of the table, and our fingers spread out in such a way that the thumbs of each person's hands were touching each other, and their little fingers touching the little fingers of the person to the left and to the right. The room was brightly lit. We youngsters were in high spirits and thought this was just terribly funny when the elderly lady called out in a loud voice, "Is someone here?" We looked at each other roguishly, and we could hardly keep from bursting out laughing. But we did not want to offend the dear old lady, and we tried hard to keep a straight face. We stood and we waited, and all at once the little table began to shake, as if some inner force were trying to split the wood apart. Then the shaking became stronger and stronger, and suddenly the table leaned over to the side so that one of its feet was in the air, and then it fell back and stood still. "Yes," said the lady. The table said yes. When the table raps once, it means yes. When it raps twice, it means no. "Wolfgang," she said to her grandson, "take paper and pencil and write down the letters. A spirit is present." Wolfgang took a pencil and waited, and then the table began to move, rapping and rapping again. We called off the letters in the alphabet whenever the table stopped at one of the letters we had called. Wolfgang wrote down the letter. I cannot explain why this all seemed so terribly funny to us. We found it was comical to be calling out letters, and ludicrous that the old lady took everything so seriously. I could not believe for a moment that the table was moving by itself. It was surely Nicholas, the lady's grandson. The rapping itself was amusing enough, But what came afterwards made us burst out laughing irresistibly, and this made the old lady shake her head at us. But we just couldn't help laughing anyway, because if we did not want, even if we did not want to, the table suddenly began to tip over so far that its edge almost touched the floor. I thought its feet were going to slip and it would fall, but no, it came back again to an upright position, and then it began to turn and twist and move around the room. We had to run with it, and when the table began to rotate, we had to run around with it and follow it wherever it went in the room. Finally, the table came to rest in a corner and moved no more. The lady called out, "Is no one there?" The table did not move. "It was a waggish kind of spirit, because you were all so hilarious," she said, "and now all spirits are gone. Wait a moment, children, I'll have some coffee brought in," and with that she disappeared into the kitchen. We youngsters were left alone. It was my chance to ask Nicholas. "It was you who moved the table, wasn't it?" "I?" he echoed in astonishment. "I thought it was you, or Emery. But certainly wasn't I. I only played the game with the rest, but my fingertips were scarcely touching the table." We all looked at Emery. He protested earnestly. "No, I didn't move the table either." "Come on, all of you," I said. "Let's get the table to move again ourselves." All agreed, and we ran to the table, stood around it, and began with our own hands to push it back and forth to get it to move. To our great amazement, this didn't work. The table was motionless, just as a piece of wood is normally lifeless and motionless. And when we pushed it harder and harder, it simply fell over and lay on the floor. During the previous experiment, the table had sometimes leaned over so far that its edge almost touched the floor and then stood up again. But no matter how we tried, we couldn't get it to do that again. So finally, we had to agree to push the table in the same direction, all of us together. One side would rise, after which the table simply fell. We could not hold it. We could not get it to stand upright again. We looked at each other and suddenly fell silent. We couldn't understand the whole affair. None of us felt like laughing anymore. The elderly lady's two grandsons admitted quietly that they couldn't understand the matter either. But it was a fact that when their Aunt Margaret was present, even the gigantic oaken table, which was so heavy that only 4 men could carry it out of the room, would rise up in the air. Obviously, Aunt Margaret was not lifting it. On my way home, and for a long time afterwards, I thought about the moving table, and I wondered how it worked. I did not believe for a moment that a spirit had moved it, but I had to admit that an unknown force was there. After this all happened, I went on with my piano practice, went skating, fought with my fiancé, and the moving table disappeared in the storehouse of my memory. Now, it all came back to me. I could see clearly that old dear lady did not understand much about spiritualism, but perhaps there were spiritualistic groups who went into such matters very seriously. If I were to study and investigate the whole matter thoroughly without prejudice, I might perhaps learn something through spiritualism that would help me on my path. I obtained an introduction to the leader of the largest and most famous spiritualistic group in the country. He began by giving me books to read, which I could believe or not believe. Theories cannot satisfy a seeker after truth. I wanted practice and conviction. In one book I read about a very famous medium who achieved his ability by sitting down at the very same time every day with paper and pencil, holding the pencil in his hand in readiness to write, and waiting a solid hour. This he repeated religiously day after day, week after week, month after month. After about 6 months, the pencil began to move and wrote various things. In this manner, the medium wrote a number of books, which were very famous at the time. They did not interest me, because they were sermons full of sweetness and light, and not as good as the sermons one could hear in any church. Why, I thought, should one have to call upon a spirit for things like these, if indeed it really was a spirit which moved the hand of the medium? I, too, took pencil and paper, held the pencil over the paper in readiness and waited. The first day, nothing happened. The second day, the pencil began to shake so hard, my hand shook with it. And then it began to move stiffly, jerkily, back and forth, and wrote various abracadabras on the paper. On the third day, the pencil immediately began to shake and soon wrote words one could clearly read. They looked as if they'd been written by an old person with a trembling hand. I continued the experiment every day, and the pencil went on to write longer and longer sentences. While the pencil was writing, I observed my arm and my hand. Whence came the force that moved my hand? If the pencil could write all by itself, I reflected, every pencil lying around could stand up and start writing. Therefore, without any doubt, the pencil was being moved by my arm, but without my having wanted to do so, and without my having known before it was going to write. Consequently, the force must be coming from a source outside my own consciousness, but doubtless from me. It can be a force coming from my subconscious, but for the present there's no proof that this force comes from a strange being outside myself, or let us say from a spirit. But who knows precisely what our subconscious is? I showed these writings to the leader of the spiritualist group. With amazing assurance, he said they were typically mediumistic writings coming from a spirit. I was silent. I was very cautious in making such claims. Excuse me. I am very cautious in making such claims. It was certain that the force was moving my arm and did not come from my consciousness, for there was no active will on my part to move the pencil. But this force could still come from me, from my unconscious. The fact that spiritualists believe that these forces come from spirits is no proof that it really is so. I continued the experiments and observed myself and the pencil. One Sunday afternoon, my husband and I were sitting together. He was reading a book and I was busy with my wood carving. And as I worked with my hands, I thought about the recent experiments with pencil, paper, and the strange writing. If it is possible, I concluded, for my hand, my nerves, or any yet unknown instrument within me to receive and manifest the thoughts of a strange, disembodied being outside myself, then it must also be possible in exactly the same way for me to receive and manifest the thoughts of another person, separate from myself but dwelling in a body. This would mean a step forward along my path. I told my husband what I was thinking about and asked whether he felt like making an experiment in thought transmission with me. He agreed immediately, and he was eager to know whether we would succeed. I did not know how such experiments are made, but I imagined that if I wanted to receive the thoughts of another person, the most important thing for me to do is to make myself completely passive and empty of my own thoughts so they would not intrude. Then with my right hand, I held his left wrist, thinking this would help us to have some sort of physical connection, and relaxing all my muscles, trying to think of nothing, I waited. I imagined that for successful thought transference, my husband would think about something, and his thought would in some way or other appear in my mind. I was thus expecting a thought that would not be coming from me. At the time, I never realized that we do not actually know the source of the thoughts that we believe to be our own. To my great amazement, something quite different happened, something for which I was truly not prepared. As I stood there with my husband and waited to receive a thought from him, I felt very distinctly and even saw that a stream of force about 3 to 4 inches thick flowed out of his solar plexus, surrounding my body like a lasso, also about the height of the solar plexus. I felt this flow of force as distinctly as if it had been material, very fine, like a dense mist, but nevertheless material. After this flow of force surrounded me, it pulled me unmistakably in a definite direction, so that I had to take a step. Then it pulled me on and on. Whenever I took a step in the wrong direction, it distinctly pulled me back into the right direction. In this way, we reached the window where the materialized will of my husband left me standing. Then came a new surprise. My left arm, which was hanging down at my side as usual, suddenly rose in the air, becoming weightless. Until then, I'd never realized that my arms hung downward because of the gravitational attraction of the earth. One hears about gravitation in earth, but I had never before been conscious of the fact that my own arm hung downward because of this force. There, in front of the window, however, I was able to experience for myself the fact that my arm lost its weight and rose up in the air when the earth's gravitational pull ceased. As my arm moved upward, it also raised the curtain. I had not moved a single muscle, so it seemed. It was as if a mass flowing out of my husband's solar plexus was supporting my arm, and then this mass pushed my head forward until my nose touched the window pane. At this moment, the mass left my body, my arm, and my head, and I was able to move freely again. We looked at each other and we were both very excited. I was thrilled by this new experience, and in fact, that the human will flows out of the solar plexus, literally reaching another person, embracing him like an octopus, and even canceling out the effect of gravity. This material seemed as if it consisted of myriads of little droplets of mist, somewhat like a Milky Way appears in the sky at night. It was as if these droplets of mist were all closely related to each other and all flowing in one direction. My husband was excited because he could not understand how it was possible for me to carry out everything he was thinking, going to the window, raising the curtain, looking out the window pane, just as if I were an automaton. I told him that there was a stream of force flowing out of his solar plexus, and that I had felt this stream as dearly as if it had been material. I think that's another typo. Okay, I had felt this stream as clearly as if it had been material. I told him also that it is only subjective when we feel something to be matter. Force gives us the impression of matter. I recalled that once, several years previously, when our child had a stomach ache, and I put an electric heating pad on his stomach, I found when stroking his face that his skin, which was normally as fine and as soft as a rose petal, suddenly felt as rough and as coarse as a rasp. I felt as if I were stroking the face of a man 2 days unshaven. We found out that the heating pad had become a bit damp, and some of the current was leaking into the child's body. When I switched off the heating pad, our baby's skin ceased to feel rough to the touch. Hence, to my hand, the electric current felt like coarse matter. When we consider the fact that everyone can check for himself, we can decide whether we want to compare this material manifestation of the human will with a form of matter or with electric current. The result is the same in either case, for modern science knows that matter is nothing but a form of energy, vibration, and only gives us the impression of being matter because it is impenetrable for us. It was the custom for our whole family to get together every Sunday evening, so I soon found myself telling the assembled group about our experience that afternoon. Everybody immediately wanted to try some experiments too. First, I stood up with Mother. Everyone else sat quiet as a mouse and tried to think about nothing. For when I was in this ultra-receptive condition, I was so sensitive to the thoughts of persons present that this would have disturbed our thought transference experiment. With Mother, I experienced something new again. The current she emitted was weaker, much finer and smaller in diameter than that of my husband. Then I made the same experiment with the various uncles, aunts, and other relatives who were gathered that evening for supper at my parents' house. In these experiments, I learned that each individual emits a different kind of current. One of my uncles, who always found it difficult to make up his mind and discipline his thoughts, sent out a large, powerful stream of thought, but the tiny particles of force in this current did not flow in the same direction, but to and fro in a chaotic manner. The effect was just as chaotic. It was a very difficult task for me, too, to find what he wanted. One of my aunts had a very thin but piercing, sharp flow of current, which to me felt like a stiff, hard wire, hurtful to the touch. We all knew her as a very aggressive person. Each and every person present had a different radiation of will. This opened up a new world for me. I began to understand many phenomena which I had previously only felt or suspected, or not noticed at all. All at once it was clear to me why a person can be just as tired after a dispute or argument as if he had been through a wrestling match. I also understood why being together with other persons sometimes is very tiring and sometimes very refreshing and stimulating. I understood clearly and in an almost physically palpable manner that the real meaning of sympathy and antipathy, emanations that give and those that absorb. The former radiates strength, while the latter cling to a person like the arms of an octopus, drawing out and absorbing his strength. This kind of experiment with such people always made me weak, so that my knees would be trembling when the experiment was over. I would have to sit down completely exhausted and wait for a while to recover strength to continue the experiments. On this particular evening, everyone in the family, including the maid, the cook, and my parents' other servants, wanted to make an experiment in thought transference with me. During that period of my life, I learned something else, a fact which cannot be changed by any human decree, namely, that cultured, self-disciplined people emit a very different radiation from those of coarse, uncouth people living only for the satisfaction of their instincts. Naturally, this is not a matter of social or economic class. Many a simple, unlettered, untutored person living near a forest or on a mountainside, alone and often completely untouched by civilization, emits a higher and purer form of vibration than those of learned, highly educated, and well-read but completely egotistical persons. These radiations cannot be hidden, falsified, counterfeited, or explained away. They reveal immediately the kind of person one is dealing with. I acquired another interesting bit of information through these experiments. Whenever someone wanted me to do something that was against the code of conduct that I had been taught to accept, this latter stood like an insulating wall between the will of the other person and myself, and it required tremendous effort on my part to overcome this obstacle with an almost explosive breakthrough. These experiments always fatigued me greatly, even when I was experimenting with people who had positive disposition. I first had to empty my own mind and will in order to be receptive to the will of the other, that is, to make the will of the other person conscious within myself and guide the other person's vibrations through my own nerves, suppressing as much as possible my own radiations. This was actually the hardest part. Our nerves are always adapted to our own vibrations. Their power of resistance is adjusted to our own vital current. Every change in our mental or physical state requires an effort from our nerves, irrespective of whether this change is upward or downward. It always makes demands on our nerves. Even when we experience such mental or spiritual changes within ourselves, they can often be harmful, irrespective of whether they are caused by a sudden shock, a passionate outburst, or even excessive joy. Under these conditions, it is understandable that it can be tiring or deleterious to have to adapt our nerves to completely strange vibrations, differing from our own not only in frequency, but even in their very nature. When the difference in vibrations is very great, the result can be substantial damage, overexcitement of the nerves, neuritis, or other diseases of the nerves. This explains why many sensitive people always get mysteriously sick in certain environments. It also explains the great danger threatening every medium, namely the loss of his own character. Unfortunately, this is what happens unavoidably in most cases. The medium receives all kinds of vibrations, but cannot digest them or assimilate them, so he or she becomes chaotic, unreliable, weak-willed himself. We should never play with these things. The literature of this field contains masses of sad stories of different mediums who finally degenerated into weak-willed automatons, receiving any and all kinds of impressions, possessing no resistance of their own, and finally being exposed in quotes, as lying, cheating frauds. No wonder, as a direct result of their abilities as a medium, their own will became weaker and weaker until they became a mere plaything for the spectators around them. I myself was witness to this kind of development. One woman with unusually great ability as a medium was able initially to perform prodigious feats. Later, however, she lost her own character to an ever-increasing extent, getting to the point where she had less and less resistance to put up against other people's wishes and was always eager to perform an experiment. Whenever the unknown power did not appear, she began to cheat in order to satisfy the curious people around her. The story ended with a gigantic scandal. As usual, the ignorant people triumphed, claiming that all this woman's accomplishments were nothing but a hoax from beginning to end. No, her accomplishments were not at all a fraud by any means. On the other hand, precisely as a direct result of her true ability as a medium, she became so weak-willed and lacking in character that she finally ended up as a cheat. I was able to observe these effects on myself. I did not want to deceive myself. I wanted to learn the truth, and as time went on, I discovered the very pernicious effects of experiments of this nature. I was conscious enough and had sufficiently strong will to overcome foreign vibrations and to become myself again after each experiment. However, I found that having to resist the influences of other persons made me feel very tired and nervous and led me to stop the activity. Later, I gave up all spiritualistic experiments completely. I know very well that many spiritualists claim their work of manifesting is not tiring or injurious. I hope they will pardon me for giving my plain, straightforward opinion based on many years of experiments, namely that those mediums who do not feel tired after their experiments never receive the will of another person or being, but merely produce manifestations from their own unconscious. This despite their firm conviction that their manifestations come from beings outside themselves. My experiments convinced me that a person can receive his own will from some unsuspected complex lying deep in his own subconscious and manifest it just as he would the mill of another being. I'm thinking this is maybe the will of another being? But it says M-I-L. Okay, this is the reason for most of the self-deceptions which occur in this field, but it is impossible to discuss these matters intelligently with ignorant people. They stick to their fantastic belief in spirits, deceiving themselves and whole hosts of undisciplined and gullible people. They have not the vaguest idea about their own unconscious powers. On the other hand, persons who are determined to learn the truth and systematically check and investigate all phenomena can discover extremely interesting facts. We just have to be careful when we use the word spirit. Let us just reflect for a moment. If a person will cause harm, if a person's will can cause the arm of another person to rise and thus conquer the gravitational pull of the earth, how much more can it do? What is the limit of its powers? As I began to learn these facts, I understood the phenomena known here in the West as levitation, an exercise still practiced diligently and carried out even today in the monasteries of Tibet. Without ever having heard of these Tibetan exercises at the time, my experiments led me to the same conclusions. The phenomenon is known in Europe too, and reliable eyewitnesses have described how the great Teresa of Avila, John of the Cross, and Francis of Assisi all were observed to rise and float in the air, not only once, but on numerous occasions, and for hours at a time. I know that this is possible, for a person's own willpower has the same effect as that of another person and can overcome the Earth's gravitational pull for a certain period of time. It all depends on the size and the strength of the will. There were also times during my experiments when I could not become conscious of another person's will. At such times it was impossible for me to manifest what he was thinking. On such occasions I felt as if the mass of his will were bearing down on me like a giant weight. I found it hard to breathe, sighing and groaning as if I were dying. I would then ask the person concerned to concentrate better. As soon as I became conscious of his will and carried it out, I was able to breathe easily and freely again, and the terrible pressure ceased. These experiments gave me the conviction that in many cases, asthma is nothing else but the invisible will of another person bearing down like a heavy weight upon the diseased individual. On the other hand, this invisible, unexecuted will can be that of the diseased person himself, coming forth from his unconscious and causing his sickness without his knowing that the disease is indeed the result of his own will. Our entire life consists of such invisible battles. In some we are defeated, in others victorious. These experiments and experiences were a splendid school for me. They gave me the opportunity to look deep into the unconscious and to get thoroughly acquainted with myself and with other people. I became firmly convinced that it's possible to receive the thoughts of another being, but at the same time I saw how extremely difficult it is. I came to understand why the Tibetans or the East Indians spend 3 days in wilderness, miles away from every human settlement, fasting, praying, and otherwise preparing themselves before they seek to establish a connection with the spirit of a departed person. Certainly not the way thousands of so-called spiritualists, after their work in an office or in the midst of a completely worldly life, gather together and believe they can suddenly be in rapport with the world beyond. They imagine that saying a quick little prayer will protect them from danger. Have they ever been able to observe that saying a prayer can keep a person who jumps into an abyss from falling to his death? Experimenting ignorantly with spiritualism represents just as great a danger as jumping into the abyss. Let us be reasonable. Let us not forget that we have the power of reason in order to check and test all experiences. During the many years that I have spent in the most widely differing groups, I was forced to observe how countless catastrophes, nervous breakdowns, suicide, and serious mental disorders resulted from the irresponsible games people call spiritualism. Well-intentioned, honest, but completely ignorant and psychologically unschooled people hold seances. Ignorant people call into being powers whose origin and nature is completely unknown to them. Neither understanding these powers nor being able to control them, they are completely at their mercy. Only people who are strong enough to resist all influences have deep psychological knowledge, extensive experience, and an enormous conscious willpower and self-control should concern themselves and experiment with spiritualism.